Hey, good morning. This is Michael Kolbeck, your Truth Activator for Rise Again, and I want to take a moment to share a message with you that I got to speak and that I got to share at Unity Center here in my local community just recently. I've got a recording of that, but I wanted to make a little better recording just to give you a little bit more ease as you listen to the message that I have to share. About a month ago, I said yes to me. I said yes to me. But it started a while back before that. You see, this past June, about 4 months or so ago, I traveled down to Houston, Texas to go to MD Anderson Cancer Center again for one of my 6-month follow-ups for the cancer treatments that I had done. And while I was down there for the week. I was going to my appointments, getting the scans done, all the fun stuff that you do. And yet while I was there, I was in a nice apartment complex. I was working remote, and I'd take breaks now and then, go walk around the complex, use the swimming pool. It was just a nice change of scenery and a nice change of pace. It was outside of the normal routine. And sometimes when you get outside of the normal routine, the normal place that you live, you get some clarity, right? And I got a little bit of clarity. I noticed while I was down there, I don't take enough time off just to do something for myself. And so I made a commitment to myself down there. I made myself a commitment in June that in October, I would take at least a week off. I'll fast forward a little bit. I'm sitting there working from home, doing my remote stuff. All of a sudden, it's October 1st. Now, I wasn't completely remiss of the date. I had been sitting around looking at things on VRBO, Airbnb, bookmarking places just here and there, anything that I was drawn to a little bit. I had a couple places bookmarked up in Northwest Iowa and some places bookmarked down in Eureka Springs, Arkansas. And I went out real quick, booked 3 days on my calendar for work. So I'm going to take these 3 days off, hook them into a weekend. Now I was already playing a little game here because that's not what I had agreed to back in June or committed to for myself. And about a week later, I had a conversation with a couple of wonderful friends of mine. Now, these two lovely ladies, as we sat there and we chatted just about anything under the sun, somehow I started conversing and talking about possible trips I'd want to take. And about maybe going to Northwest Iowa or Eureka Springs. And when I got done with my discourse, my two friends sat there and they were just staring back at me. And they had these big smiles on their faces. And I started laughing and I said, "What?" And they said, "Do you hear yourself?" And I know the smile on my face at that point grew a little bit wider because I knew exactly what they were going to say. They said, "Do you hear yourself? When you talk about Eureka Springs, it's like, wow, there's Michael. It's like Michael suddenly comes alive. Not that I wasn't present before in the conversation or anything, but wow, you can just tell there's a lot of passion there when you talk about Eureka Springs. And the energy doesn't lie." And at the end of the conversation, these two lovely ladies, having gone through some life coach certification, all of us in the same group, they knew to challenge the masculine. And at the end of the call, they said, "So what are you going to do, Michael?" And I smiled and I said, "Well, isn't it obvious?" I said, "You have both been such powerful mirrors, reflecting back to me what I already knew." I said, "When I get off this call, I'm booking 7 days off. And it looks like I'm going to Eureka Springs." And I was excited about it. And the next day, I checked my work calendar. I figured out what the 7 days would look like, where that would fit. Happened to be, I could tie it right into my birthday. And the very last step that I needed to do was to check and see if if one of these places that I had bookmarked, there was a particular place in Eureka Springs that I had bookmarked that for whatever reason I was continually drawn to. I sat down and thought, well, let's just see if it's available for those 7 days. And to my surprise, it was. I sat there in my recliner in the living room, phone in hand. All I had to do was click reserve. And that was that. And suddenly, the stories started in my mind. You don't need to take 7 days off. I mean, what are you going to do in Eureka Springs for 7 days? You're going by yourself. Plus, with the type of work I do, I don't work, I don't get paid. I mean, you could just shorten the trip by 2 or 3 days. Just think, work that extra 2 or 3 days, have that money coming in. And the dollar signs started going. But I knew what I had committed to. I knew the powerful reflections that my friends had given me. Why would I pass this up? I had a decision to make, right? And in that moment, I took a breath. I reminded myself. I came back to my center here. And I clicked reserve. And just that quickly, all the stories stopped. They just disappeared. And I was flooded with this sense of excitement, like, yes! Like I actually did it. I'm going to go to Eureka Springs for 7 days. And what was more exciting is I had waited so long to do it. It was just around the corner now. It was just a few days away. I got up. I was walking and pacing my living room. I was laughing. The next moment I was crying for whatever reason. And sometimes that's just the thing. They were tears of joy. For whatever reason, that energy needed to move and I let it come through. And as I paced the floor and as I was laughing again and smiling and feeling this excitement about this trip, suddenly I got more clarity. I got more insight. Suddenly I realized this is the first trip since January of 2019, when I was diagnosed with stage 3 rectal cancer, which was that close to stage 4, that this would be the first trip that was non-cancer related. And I was overcome. I was flooded with emotion because I hadn't realized that before. It had been almost 3 years where every trip I had been on had something to do with cancer. For 9 months, I traveled around doing alternative treatments in various states within the United States. And then after that, after things continued to get worse, symptoms continued to get worse, etc., I ended up at a place I never even knew about. But due to synchronicities, etc., that were going on in my life, I ended up at MD Anderson Cancer Center. Wonderful place, wonderful doctors. And in fact, in the year of 2020, drove back and forth for chemo treatments, radiation, and surgery over 20,000 miles to do what needed to be done. And yet here I was on the brink of this exciting trip. And in fact, I knew that I was scheduled to speak at Unity Center before my trip to Eureka Springs. And I had worked on a couple ideas and they just weren't coming together. They just weren't gelling. And I said, you know what? I'm just going to let it go. Something will come, either while I'm down in Eureka Springs or right afterwards. I still got time to let them know what I'm going to be speaking on. And so I wrote this very message. I went to Eureka Springs with no plans, absolutely nothing on the agenda. And one day it just came to me. How about saying yes to you? And I grabbed my laptop and I sat in the common area of the Piedmont bed and breakfast there in Eureka Springs. And as I wrote this in about 30 or 40 minutes, I was blessed with the privilege to look out through these windows of this common room. And in the back were the Ozark Mountains, the trees covering the Ozark Mountains. And it was the second or third week of October at this point. Beautiful time. All the changing colors of fall. And on top of that, staring back at me was this statue of Jesus with his arms spread wide, as if a huge embrace. Jutting up and out over the trees on that mountain, the statue that is associated down there with the Passion Play. And all of this happened simply because I said yes to me. But it wasn't always like that. In fact, it was quite the opposite. You see, all of my life up until about 5 or 6 years ago, I was a people pleaser, a yes monster, somebody who lived by all the rules, the shoulds, the obligations, the expectations, all of these imprinted beliefs within me of how I was supposed to live my life, who I was supposed to be. And part of that, a massive part of that, which I didn't know at the time, was so entrenched in codependency. My whole perspective on everything was other-oriented. It was saying yes to everybody else, and it was almost always at the expense of myself. In fact, saying yes to myself, it was quite uncomfortable. And saying yes to myself, for the most part, didn't even really register. Because I really didn't register anywhere in the level of priority. I was taught, the messages I picked up was that everybody else came first. And it was my job to take care of them, my responsibility to take care of them, to fix them, to save them. And that was the way I lived my life. And in fact, saying yes to me generally brought up all kinds of uncomfortable feelings. Because I was thinking about me. It seemed wrong. It seemed almost sinful, which is a word I don't like, and yet from the background that I have, it very much applied at the time. In the rare instances that I would actually say yes to myself, after battling internally with whether I should or should not do that, I was plagued by judgment, by guilt, by all kinds of shame, like, how dare you? Who do you think you are saying yes to you? There was such a part of me that believed that I did not deserve any priority. That if I said yes to myself, it was absolutely nothing but selfishness. But life has a way of getting your attention. You see, it had been trying to get my attention for years. But I was too busy taking care of everybody else. And going through the experiences of life and sometimes hearing the still small voices, I would get messages, I would get things, information that I didn't realize at the time was for me. I would get something and I would just pass it on to another. You see, I was what I call an unbalanced giver, always giving to everybody else. And have you ever noticed that somebody who is an unbalanced giver, that they're not very good receivers? So you see, the messages that I was getting through the experiences of life, etc., I wasn't taking them and applying them and integrating them. No, I was just kind of receiving them, but pushing them right on to somebody else because I always thought they were for somebody else, not for me. Turns out those messages were indeed for me. Life has a way of getting your attention. One of my previous mentors used to say, life will speak to you in that still small voice, that whisper. And life will keep knocking. And that knock will get louder and louder, and soon it will become a roar. And if you still don't listen, life will keep knocking, and it will become louder and louder until it is deafening. And if you still continue to ignore, you will have what he termed a massive force of instability. And that is what happened in my life. You see, everything was about to change. For on a fateful day 5 or 6 years ago, I said yes to myself, but it was altogether different from this experience of saying yes to go to Eureka Springs. No, on this fateful day 5 or 6 years ago, I said yes to myself. When I left my family, my home, my wife, rather than continuing to wait around for validation, appreciation, that I had realized at this point, after being married for 15 years, wasn't ever going to happen. And that with the individual that I was in a relationship with, the dynamic was never going to change. No matter how much I changed, the dynamic was not going to change. The environment wasn't going to change. The only option left for me was to stay and know it would continue on a downward spiral or leave. And I said yes to me. And it was a brutal, hard lesson in learning how to make myself a priority and say, you know what? My life, my family, my wife, etc., they were all sacred to me. But now I was finally saying, wait a minute, I'm sacred too. I deserve a place on the list of priority, a place that I had never really given myself any priority before. So why should I expect those that I'm in relationship with to give me any priority when I couldn't do it for myself? I said yes to me on that fateful day. It altered the course of my life in such a good way, and yet at the time I felt like an utter failure. So I was living on my own. I was doing my job. I was still continuing to take care of all the things I needed to and take care of my family. I was going to trauma therapy for what I would find out was the domestic violence I had experienced through those 15 years. And I was taking baby steps home to myself, doing that deep inner work that you have to do. Because no matter how much I wanted to blame the other person, I had enough experiences in my life to say, wait a minute here. Yeah, there's issues with the people that I'm in relationship with in my different romantic relationships throughout the years. But at the same time, the same pattern keeps showing up over and over. I'm the only common denominator there, even though the names and the faces and the places may change. And so I started looking at what is it within here? It's not a blame thing. It's simply taking a look in that mirror of self and determining what is within me that allows this, that thinks for whatever reason that type of treatment of me was okay. And I was doing the inner work and I was doing all of these things, and my life at that time was quite messy, let's put it that way. I was stepping out into a huge area of the unknown and everything was changing. And as I did this hard inner work, sometimes I just needed a break from everything. And there was always this game that looked so fun to me. It was Assassin's Creed. It always looked so fun. So I stopped in at a GameStop. I thought, wow, okay, I can get a used Xbox and Assassin's Creed for $100. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. In fact, it bothered me so much. And even though I felt so drawn to it, like I just need this break. I just need something to escape with a little bit, to shut my mind off and just be able to relax and not do all the stuff. But it was so troubling for me that I had to take it in and I had to discuss it and talk about it with my trauma therapist. And we played with it while we were in there. And she said to me at the end of the session, she said, Michael, what if you gave yourself permission? What if you gave yourself permission to go out and to buy that game? And she said, I want to challenge you. Here again was a feminine that was challenging somebody who identifies more in the masculine energy. Rather than inviting me or encouraging me, she said, I want to challenge you that before our next session that you go out, that you buy that game, that you spend some time with it, and you come back and you tell me about your experience. And that's exactly what I did. And it really was freeing. It again was part of the practice of saying yes to me, because it was never about the $100. I had the $100. It didn't matter if I was buying and looking at something for $100 or something for $20. It was the same thing, the same mechanisms going off in me. Well, you can't do that. I mean, think of the things you should be doing with that money. Well, you're irresponsible if you spend that money that way. These were the voices going on in my head from this belief system within me that I was trying to undo. This was a significant step for me to be able to do this, to go out and buy that Xbox and that game, and just give myself then permission to not continue to do the healing work. This was part of the healing work, to give myself some rest and some play within it. These were all practices about saying yes to me, all practices of knowing myself. Ironically, I would spend the next few years of my life saying yes to me. For so long, for all of the previous period of my life, for decades, it had been yeses for everybody else. The pendulum always swung over here and basically remained here all the time. Saying yes to everybody else, almost always at the expense to myself. Now it had finally swung back. And it kind of hung over here on the other side. While I learned how to say yes to me, while I learned that it was okay to say yes to me, while I learned that I deserved to be treated as sacred as well, to be honored, to be respected, and that had to start with me. And little did I know that the more I learned to say yes to me, no's just became more automatic for everybody else. And that these yeses were establishing boundaries, were helping me get to know myself. What do I like? What do I not like? What is this with Michael? And now, where I am, the pendulum has swung. And it swings freely now, back and forth, in a balanced way, as it should, as it is meant to, as it is intended to. And now there are yeses for me, and now there are yeses for others. And back and forth it goes. But the truth of the matter is that when I give a yes to myself or a yes to another, that it is from a place of truth, from a place of authenticity in here. It's not based on rules and expectations and obligations and shoulds and supposed tos. It's not based on the story of, well, if I don't do it and I don't say yes to this thing out here, or yes to somebody else that's asking me something, well, if I don't say yes, then who's going to do it? That was one of the strongest stories that I had that crippled my life for years. And it went back to the belief that I was responsible for everybody else. In fact, being told by some preachers that I would be the only Jesus some people ever see. And that's why it was so important to be this perfect representation of Jesus. There's no truth in that. There's no authenticness in that. There's no real humanity in that. That's an abandonment of self to be something, an idealistic notion. To be something other than what you are. So when was the last time you said yes to you? Does that thought ever cross your mind? And when you do say yes to you, how do you feel? Does it feel uncomfortable? And what do you do If you're entertaining these thoughts about possibly saying yes to you, or if you do say yes and you have these feelings of uncomfortableness, you play with it. You get curious with it. It's no different than how a kid shows up in the world. They play with the things around them. They get curious. They get interested in those things. Why? Because they're learning. They're discovering. They're not only discovering how the world works, they're discovering truths about themselves during that play. And so if I want to take you through an exercise here that will walk you through how to play with it. So wherever you're at, as long as you're not driving your car, I want you to just tune in to yourself and begin to breathe deeply in through your nose, out through your mouth. Just begin to focus on that breath. The rise and the fall, the inhale, the exhale. Notice the balance that is there. Giving to others, giving to self, saying yes to others, saying yes to self. There's a balance there. And as you breathe, I want you to feel as if you were dropping into your body. Just give yourself permission to be right here, right in this moment. We're not going to make any decisions here. We're not going to make any commitments. We're just taking this moment for yourself to just be with you. And as you continue to breathe, just imagine that heart space just opening up. And open it up just as far as you're comfortable with. And as you have that heart space open, just allow yourself to soften. Feel your feet on the floor. Knowing that you are supported by God, by Source, by the All. That you are held. And from this place, I want you to ask yourself, what is one thing you desire to say yes to for you? Notice what goes on there. Maybe it's a dream of yours. Maybe it's just having a conversation with your partner or with a loved one or with a person you don't know. Maybe it's some time to yourself. What is that thing you want to say yes to for you? And if you have more than one thing that's coming up, just choose one thing. Notice as well, if it's hard for you to find saying yes to you. Maybe the only thing you're feeling right now is all the yeses you should be saying for others, and that's okay. Just notice there's nothing wrong with that. It's just simply where you might be. And just choosing that one thing that you want to say yes to for you. What if in this moment you gave yourself permission to say yes to that thing, to say yes to you? And what does that feel like? Just notice as you feel into your body, what sensations are there? Maybe there's a tingling of excitement. Maybe there's a place that feels tense. Maybe there's a place that feels like as if it wants to get up and run. It's okay, just notice. Maybe there's a part of you that feels freedom in this. Ecstatic excitement in this. Maybe there's a part of you that feels very uncomfortable, as though you shouldn't be doing this. Just notice. There's no need to change anything. Just be present to where you are in this moment. And it's all okay. And now take your awareness to your thoughts. What kind of thoughts have been coming through during this exercise? Are they thoughts of judgment or shame? That you don't deserve this in some way? Or are they thoughts that, yes, I finally am saying yes to me? Or this feels so good? And just notice. Simple exercise like this is how we make the unconscious conscious and bring that we're unaware of into our awareness as we feel, as we observe our own inner state of being. And when you are ready, I want you to take those parts of self, those feelings, those thoughts, because we can have a feeling and a thought that is completely opposite of one another. Or maybe they're in line. But either way, I want you to take these parts of self and just visualize, act as though you were giving them a big hug and embracing them and welcoming them in. That you see them, that you hear them. You are simply validating them, which is one of the most profound experiences that we can have. And our true strength and power is in being able to validate ourselves. It's the same thing that we all naturally do with children. When a child comes to us hurting or excited or has discovered something new, we embrace them. We comfort them. We hold them. We let them know they are seen, cherished, and loved. We don't shun them and reject them and shame them. And this embracing is all we're doing. It's a validation of self. It's a self-partnering to say yes. For these are all parts of you. A few mantras that I have found useful and powerful in saying yes and learning the practice of saying yes to me is all permission granted. All permission granted. And second, what's highest and best for me is highest and best for all. There is absolute truth in both of those. This goes back to the saying of, you cannot serve from an empty well. It's a place that I served from and lived from for so long, where servanthood equated to sacrifice of self and abandonment. And it cost me far more than I ever could have imagined. But there was another individual that had to say yes to himself. Jesus. It's not often put that way. But think about all the times, think about all the teachings. Most of us have gone to church at some point in our life. I know I grew up in church as almost a second home. And so many of the teachings that I heard back then and that I continue to hear in different churches, so much focus on the ministries and the teachings of Jesus. And yes, those are important. But there was always very little about the time that he took away for himself. Notice, Before those big lengthy passages where Jesus is ministering to others, what does he do? He goes off by himself. It may only be a few verses, but he goes off by himself to pray, to spend time alone, to pray with his disciples. He makes sure he is grounded and solid here, saying yes to himself, making himself a priority before he ever goes out and ministers to others, knowing that he cannot serve from an empty well. 30 years ago, I went away to college. I went away to Bible college, to be in fact. And after I got done with a couple of years in Bible college, I spent a good bit of my time in my 20s filling in as pulpit supply and going around to various churches in the state preaching. And I would do this a number of times throughout the year, and I loved it. But today, when I shared this particular message at Unity Center a week or so ago, it was the first time in over 20 years that I got up and spoke and shared in this way in front of a group of people. How did that happen? Simple. I said yes to myself. You see, some things had changed dramatically in my life in the last 6 to 8 months. I was in a place where my body was healed from a lot of the different things. I'd figured out some things to help tweak my body, to help it in its new way of being after the cancer treatments, etc. And I thought, well, maybe I can get back into doing some of the things I used to love so much. Some other things had shifted. I was back in my own place finally. And I started going back to Unity Center, which was now close by. And the first Sunday that I was there, Mavis got up and spoke. A woman named Mavis got up and spoke. And as she was speaking, I had that same feeling that I always have when somebody else is up in front speaking and I'm sitting there in the chair. It's a feeling where I can hardly contain myself, and I have to really consciously focus on keeping my feet planted where I am and staying in my seat. Why? Because my being wants to be up there. Not for validation, not for recognition, not because the person up front is doing a bad job or is doing it wrong. None of that. It's simply because that is what feels so aligned with me. It feels so true to me and natural to me. And so I told myself while Mavis was speaking, I was like, I don't know how this works here, but I'm going to reach out to Unity when I get home today, and I'm going to see if I can speak there. Lo and behold, I reached out to Unity. A day or so later, they contacted me. We had some conversations back and forth, and the next thing you know, I was scheduled to speak. And it was such a wonderful thing, and it was all because I said yes to me. All of these wonderful things in life. Sometimes that saying yes to you is a powerful yes that feels so good. Other times saying yes to you is like that time 5 or 6 years ago where it feels terrible. You know it's the thing to do, but there is so much pain with it. But it is the next step you must take to come further home to yourself. What will you begin to say yes to in life for you? And are you on the list of priority in your life, in your relationships, in the things that you do? You see, the truth is, we can't expect anybody else in life to make us a priority if we aren't making ourselves a priority. Remember this. When practicing saying yes to you, simply be here. Go within what is authentic for you. Notice your feelings, your thoughts. That is where we have the freedom then. When we become aware of what is going on within, we can then make a choice that's in alignment with us. It's an alignment within the truth of who we are. And always remember this. That's what is highest and best for me is truly highest and best for all. Much blessings and love to each of you.